Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session, session 5 of the UFAW conference, Recent Advances in Animal Welfare Science 7. This is the second day of a 2-day meeting. I hope that you've enjoyed all the previous sessions. If you've been with us before, this is the first session you've joined. Welcome. You've missed some very good presentations, and you will find a link to watch recordings of those presentations on demand in the email you'd have been sent to remind you to join this webinar. And we will have the recordings up for these sessions 3, 4, and 5, I hope today by about 10 o'clock in the evening, UK time. As always, if you wish to answer questions at this meeting, use the drop-down box and I will share them with the presenter. We also have an extensive range of posters that I really urge you to look at. There's a fantastic range of 60 of them, and to access those, you need to use the Dropbox link in the email that was sent to you. And also, we have handouts that you can download. You need to do these before this session finishes. That would be for the abstract booklet and the certificate of attendance and the code if you wish to get money off the UFAW Wiley Blackwell series. I'm not going to say anything more. I think we're now ready to begin, and we've got a very interesting talk to kick off session 5 from Colline Poirier from Newcastle University, and she's going to be talking about neuroimaging assessment of chronic stress in sheep.
Sheep are a common farm species, but also an emerging model in biomedical research. For instance, they have been used as a model of stroke, epilepsy, and brain injury. For this reason, sheep can be exposed to not only husbandry but also experimental challenges that might potentially compromise their welfare. Being able to measure their affective states is therefore particularly important. Measuring affective states is notoriously difficult. Physiological measures such as HPA-axis activity and cardiac activity can be used to assess changes in arousing levels. However, changes in affective state valence are more difficult to assess. In sheep, different behavioral tests inspired by the rodent literature have been used, including the open field test, the novel object test, and the unknown human test. Cognitive bias tests, including judgment and attentional tests, have also been developed. However, the behavioral approaches have provided conflicting results in sheep. In addition, they are prone to learning effects. In animal welfare, as in other experimental sciences, the 2x2 design is one of the most powerful designs. By testing a group of animals before and after an experimental manipulation, researchers can avoid a genetic source of variability in their measure, while with a control group, they can control for any time effect unrelated to the experimental manipulation. However, approaches which are prone to learning or habituation effects are ill-suited for this 2x2 design, since the effect of the experimental manipulation can be masked by those learning effects. Measures of hippocampal plasticity is a new approach that has been recently proposed to assess long-lasting affective states. They have been shown to be correlated with subjective psychological well-being and moods in humans, and to be sensitive to antidepressant drugs in animal models such as rodent and non-human primates. Hippocampal plasticity has also been shown to decrease with aversive events such as physical and social stress, and to increase with rewarding events such as environmental enrichment, sexual activity, voluntary physical exercise, and mindfulness meditation. These studies in humans and animal models suggest that hippocampal plasticity measures reflect the valence of the affective state rather than the arousal level. Previous studies have also shown that hippocampal plasticity is dose-dependent, the size of the effect increasing with the duration or the number of aversive or rewarding events an individual has been exposed to. Finally, hippocampal plasticity can be measured non-invasively and repeatedly using MRI, making this approach well suited for a 2x2 design. For those of you interested to know more about the properties of hippocampal plasticity, you can find more information in this publication. The different lines of evidence supporting the use of hippocampal plasticity as a measure of long-lasting affective states come from studies in humans, rodents, and non-human primates. To apply this new approach to other animal species, it is important to first verify that the hippocampal plasticity measure can detect changes in affective states induced by an experimental manipulation that have been previously validated. The goal of this study was to test this hypothesis in sheep. More specifically, our aim was to determine whether we could detect a change in affective state using an MRI-based measure of hippocampal plasticity, a hair cortisol measure, and behavioral emotional reactivity tests. The second aim of this study was to determine whether these different approaches provide similar information or not. For this study, we used 24 adult ewes which were living in an experimental farm and which have never been involved in previous experiments. We used a 2x2 design in which half of the animals were tested before and after an affective state manipulation, and the other half were tested at the same time point but were not exposed to the manipulation. To manipulate the affective states of the animals, we chose a chronic mild stress paradigm that has been developed for sheep. This paradigm has previously been shown to induce a negative affective state associated with high arousal in sheep. It consisted in exposing sheep during 4 weeks to a variety of events routinely encountered by sheep in commercial farm settings, such as odors of dog feces, odors of sheep blood, light during the night, individual restraint, transport in cattle trucks, social isolation, and food distribution disturbance. At each time point, we measured hippocampal plasticity using MRI, hair cortisol concentration, and behavioral emotional reactivity using an open field test, a novel object test, and an unknown human test. You can see the timeline of the experiment at the bottom of this slide. The open field test consists in placing a sheep into an empty, unfamiliar arena and measuring its locomotor activity. The novel object test consists in placing a novel object at the center of the arena and measuring the time spent by the animal in proximity of the object. And the unknown human test consists in having an unfamiliar human at the center of the arena and measuring the time spent by the animal in proximity of the human being. Here are the results of the behavioral reactivity tests. In the top row, you can see the locomotor activity results of each test, and in the bottom row, the quantification of vocalizations emitted during each test. Each plot represents the differential amount of behavior between the two time points in each group, with results from the control group in red and results from the experimental group in blue. In terms of locomotor activity, you can first see that the amount of activity increased between time points in both groups, since all the values are positive. An increase in locomotor activity is classically interpreted as less fearfulness. However, we did not find any significant differences between groups. The only result close to significance is in the novel object test, but the trend is not in the expected direction, since it suggests a greater decrease of fearfulness between time points in the group exposed to the chronic stress paradigm. In terms of vocalization, in the bottom row, we can see that the number of vocalizations decreased between time points in each test, since all the values are negative. This is again classically interpreted as less fearfulness. And here again, we did not find significant differences between groups. Here are the results for the hippocampal plasticity measure. What is displayed is the rate of hippocampal volumetric changes between time points in the dorsal, intermediate, and ventral part of the hippocampus in each group. What you can see is that the rate of volumetric changes are all positive, indicating that hippocampal plasticity increased in both groups between time points. However, we observed a significant effect of group, with the increase of hippocampal plasticity being lower in the group exposed to the chronic stress paradigm compared to the control group. The interaction between the group effect and the subregion effect was not significant. Here are the results for the hair cortisol. What is displayed is the rate of cortisol concentration changes between the two time points in each group. As you can see, the hair cortisol concentration increased between time points since both values are positive. However, this increase was bigger in the group exposed to the chronic stress paradigm compared to the control group. The last analysis that we did was to test the correlation between the rate of hippocampal volumetric changes and the rate of cortisol concentration changes. As mentioned in the introduction, cortisol is considered to measure the arousal level and hippocampal plasticity the valence of the affective state. One would thus expect these two measures to be independent. However, previous studies suggest that corticosteroids play a causal role in hippocampal plasticity, in which case one might expect some correlation between the two measures. To determine whether the two measures provide the same information or not, we therefore tested their correlation. As you can see, we observed no correlation at all, with a correlation coefficient close to 0. So, to summarize, the behavioral tests were found insensitive to the affective state manipulation. They showed a learning effect with a decreased emotional reactivity in the second time point, suggesting that this test mainly reflects the acute affective state of the animals during the test rather than their long-lasting affective state altered by the chronic stress paradigm. On the contrary, hippocampal plasticity and hair cortisol measures were found sensitive to the affective state manipulation. In addition, we found that hippocampal plasticity and hair cortisol measures provided different pieces of information, supporting the notion that cortisol measures assess changes in arousal level, while hippocampal plasticity measures assess changes in the valence of the affective state. To conclude, this study demonstrates the feasibility of using an MRI approach to assess long-lasting affective states in sheep. While the availability of MRI scanners remains limited to few experimental farms, the neuroimaging approach offers the possibility to test the welfare impact of procedures routinely used in sheep and therefore to provide useful information to a large number of stakeholders. To finish, I would like to thank my collaborators and especially Mathieu Keller, Ludovic Calandreau and Hans Adriaensen, and the funders, the INRA, CNRS and Newcastle University, for funding this study. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Colline. If you would like to turn your camera and your microphone on, please. Hello. Good. Can you say a few words to us? Okay, I'll just turn it on. Try again. Yeah, we can see you, but we can't hear you. Let me just. Okay, your mic's on now, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Good. There we go. So thank you for an interesting talk. We've got some questions through. Anna Valentine says, the validation of chronic mild stress in the literature was done using which test?
So it has been done using a cognitive bias test and the 3 behavioral tests that we used as well, using a cross-sectional approach, mainly.
Thank you. Helen Gray says, thank you for a nice talk. Sorry if I missed this, but the behavioural tests used here are impacted by temperament or personality. Was this taken into account in the experimental design?
Okay, so what we did was to make sure that there was no differences in the behavioral test result between the 2 groups before we allocated each chip to each group. So there was no differences before the experimental manipulation to make sure that it was not influencing the result.
Thank you. This is a long one from Roberta Vitali. A decreased neurogenesis may explain the observed effects of the hippocampal volume. Indeed, stress as well as exercise has been reported to be amongst the factors which affect adult hippocampal neurogenesis in mammals. However, there is evidence that imposed running exercise does not alter cell proliferation in the hippocampus of sheep, suggesting that the situation may be different for this particular mammal. Is there any evidence that stress actually negatively affects cell proliferation in the hippocampus of the sheep?
That's a good question. I haven't come across any studies in sheep. So when we developed these new biomarkers, all the literature was coming from rodents and primates, human and non-human primates. In sheep, there is a lot of literature in the olfactory bulb neurogenesis, a little bit on hippocampal plasticity, but I can't remember on top of my head if it has been shown, which is what motivated this study. So we know that hippocampal plasticity is a phenomenon which is very well conserved across mammals. You will have heard yesterday the talk from Elena Armstrong that it even seems to be conserved in birds. So the strong hypothesis that we had is that we are not aware of any evidence suggesting that it might be different in sheep, but nonetheless, we still wanted to check that we could obtain a change of hippocampal plasticity in sheep, which is why we did this study. So neurogenesis is one of the 2 cellular mechanisms that would be responsible for the MRI change that we are detecting in this study.
Thank you. Jason Yee says, very interesting talk. It seems you analysed the hippocampal subregions as single volumes. Did you look at differences between left and right?
So I looked at differences between left and right, and results were very similar. The trends are the same. So and I analyzed it statistically. There was no significance between the 2 hemispheres. So that's why for this presentation I presented the data pulled between the 2 hemispheres.
Edward Nairana says, great presentation, Colline. Is it possible that the age of the sheep could influence the hippocampus plasticity? Maiden or yearling ewes may show higher reactivity to stresses.
Okay, so we know mainly based on human data that age is going to have an impact on hippocampal plasticity. And that's why it's so important to have this control group in this design to control for these age-related effects. You might have noticed that what we observe between the 2 time points is an increase of the hippocampal plasticity, which is likely to be driven by this age effect. So that's why the control group is so important to control for age effect.
One from Benjamin Lacour says, any relations between behavioural profiles expressed during the fear tests and hippocampal volume and plasticity?
Okay, so that relates to Ellen's questions about temperament. So most of the literature about these behavioral tests in sheep has been interpreting these behavioral results in terms of mood or affective state, so states. But there are few papers where the authors have suggested that perhaps it's a measure of temperament trait, of personality that we are measuring with this behavioral test. So what I tried is to test if there was, so I tried to test the hypothesis that depending of their temperament measured in the first time point, if we could predict how much the sheep will react to the chronic stress paradigm. And so I tested the correlation between the result of the behavioral test in the first time point with the variation in hippocampal plasticity. And I couldn't find any correlation. Now I must say that this correlation only involved the stress groups, so 12 subjects, and I'm not sure that we have the statistical power to answer this question definitively with this study.
Thank you. Another question. Do you have any idea about the specific mechanisms responsible for the volumetric differences? For example, neurogenesis versus apoptosis.
Versus apoptosis. Okay, so in the mammalian hippocampus, we know that apoptosis is quite reduced. So in terms of number of cells in the hippocampus, the neurogenesis is the main mechanism that would underlie these volumetric changes. Now, on top of increasing the number of neurons, we also know that there is another cellular mechanism, which is the increase of the cell size. So that's an increase in body cell size and dendritic tree size, which is the second mechanism. And studies in rodents have shown that this second mechanism has the same property than as the neurogenesis. So which means that when you're using MRI, you're you're averaging these two mechanisms, but since they seem to have the same properties, they all go in the same direction. So you just have this average signal. On the other hand, there are still some controversies about how much neurogenesis there is in some species. So with the neuroimaging approach, that means that if you're using it in a species where neurogenesis during adulthood is not so important, then your signal will mainly reflect the increase in size of the cells, while in studies where neurogenesis is still very prominent during adulthood, you would reflect neurogenesis as well. But this technique does not allow to distinguish between these two cellular mechanisms.
Thank you. And probably the last question we're going to have time for. Have you tried the same thing with a positive stimuli, such as environmental enrichment?
Okay, so these sheep are living in an experimental farm funded by INRA, where everything is done to maximize their welfare. So they live in a very enriched environment with very few stressors, so none of the usual stressors that they will encounter in a commercial setting. So while we have envisaged to try and to further improve their welfare, we saw that it was unlikely that we will be able to make a difference that could be detected by the MRI approach, because they already had such a high welfare.
Thank you, Colline, very much. So much appreciated. So we'll move now on to the next talk. And the next talk is from Joshua Woodward. And although he's recorded it, unfortunately, Joshua Woodward, who's at the Dogs Trust UK, is on furlough. So he's not able to answer your questions, but his colleague, Emma Buckland, has agreed to do so. And his talk is on owner-reported behaviour of rehome dogs in the first 14 days of adoption.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for attending this session. My name is Joshua Woodward, and today I'm going to be talking about owner-reported behaviour of rehome dogs in the first 14 days of adoption. In this presentation, I will first give an overview of the Dogs Trust post-adoption project, which provided the data for this analysis. Then I will talk about the methodology for this study, and then go over the results and areas for future investigation. Dogs Trust is the largest canine welfare charity in the UK, currently with 20 rehoming centres around the country. The post-adoption project was developed to help improve on our provision of lifetime behaviour support. Previously, we offered a call during the first week of adoption, but after that owners could call us should they need advice. As part of the project, we implemented a more refined telephone support process, whereby we actively follow up with owners at 2 additional time points, making 3 in total. This builds on our existing reactive approach, where we were reliant on adopters perceiving their dog's behaviour as being a problem and then ringing us to ask for help. We hope by offering both proactive and reactive support we can better assist owners post-adoption. We also introduced new referral pathways up to the level of clinical animal behaviourist, and we also provide veterinary support for adopted dogs within the first week of adoption. The aims of the project are to improve canine welfare by advising owners on behaviour issues, use the information we learn from adopters about their dogs after adoption to improve our adoption processes, and ultimately to improve the success of adoptions and reduce the number of unsuccessful adoptions that might result in the dog being returned to us. So this graphic shows an overview of the project. When a member of the public adopts a dog from Dogs Trust, they consent to a follow-up call after 2 days as a standard condition of the adoption, which is represented by the white paw. Optionally, owners can then consent to the post-adoption telephone calls, which are here represented by the yellow paws. So we have the standard call at 2 days, and then the optional calls scheduled at 2 weeks and at 4 months after adoption. Owners can also ring us at any time if they have a behavioural problem and they would like advice. The phone calls are standardised, and agents at our contact centre will go through a scripted survey with the adopter over the phone. In the survey, we ask about any health or behavioural problems. Depending on the owner's responses and algorithms in the surveys, a call back from our behaviour support team may be triggered with an appropriate level of priority depending on the reported behaviour. At 2 days only, a call back from our veterinary teams may also be triggered if the dog is reported to have a health problem. Just as an idea of the kind of uptake we have for this support program, in 2019 we had around 12,800 recorded adoptions over the year, and the opt-in for post-adoption follow-up telephone calls was 85%, so on the order of 11,000 adopters getting this proactive support and providing us with incredibly valuable information about how our dogs are getting on in their forever homes. So why are we so interested in post-adoption behaviour? Having a behavioural problem is the most common reason we hear from adopters for returning their dog back to our centres. In many cases, the behaviour may be indicative of poor welfare for both the dog and the adopter, and it's important to recognise these behaviours as early as possible. If we are able to identify these behaviours early on, we can support the adopters by providing appropriate training and management approaches tailored to the specific problem behaviour. The first aim for this study was to establish what the occurrence of specific adopter-reported dog behaviour is after adoption, and secondly, does the occurrence of reported behaviour for an individual dog change over time? For this study, a sample of adoptions were used from between the 9th of June and 26th of August in 2019, which equated to 2,621 adoptions. Adoptions were included in the analysis if the adopter opted in to the post-adoption calls, completed the follow-up calls at 2 days and 14 days after adoption, and any owners with multiple adoptions during this time frame, and any dogs that were adopted more than once, i.e. they were adopted and then returned back to the centre and then adopted out again, were removed from the analysis, which left 1,419 adoptions. I looked at 5 different reported behaviours after adoption. The first 2 behaviours are from a section of the telephone survey where the behaviours are prompted. For example, has your dog shown any of the following behaviours? So for the first behaviour, I looked at snapping, biting or nipping directed towards the owner or an adult member of the household. It's important to say here that the context of the behaviour was not explored in detail in this analysis, so nipping towards the owner could have occurred during play. I also looked at reported scratching or damage to the doorway, non-toy or non-food items when left alone or separated from the adopter in the house, which could be a sign of separation-related behaviour. For this question, adopters ask first if they've left their dog alone in the house without human company, and even if they haven't left the dog alone in the house, we still ask them about potential signs of separation-related behaviour in case they have shown this behaviour when separated in a different room or left at night time. The other 3 behaviours I looked at were from the section in the survey where we ask owners if there are any other behaviours the adopter was finding a problem. Specifically, I took reports of difficulty walking the dog on the lead, for example pulling or reluctance to walk, barking excessively or barking at dogs, people or towards inanimate objects, and toileting issues in the home. With this analysis, I summarised the frequency of the reported behaviours in both the 2-day and 14-day telephone surveys, and then ran a McNamara test using exact binomial probability calculations. This tests against the null hypothesis of marginal homogeneity in reports of the behaviours at 2 days and 14 days using paired data. So for example, it tests whether there is a statistically significant difference between the frequencies represented in cells B and C. Cells B and C represent whether the behaviour was reported at one time point but not at the other time point. Now on to the results. So this is for the first behaviour, which was snapping, biting or nipping towards the owner or adult member of the household. So for each dog we can see whether the behaviour was reported at 2 days, at 14 days, at both 2 days and 14 days, or at neither time point after adoption. So this behaviour was reported in 11% of dogs at either of the 2 time points, and the behaviour was not reported at either time point for 89% of the adopted dogs in this sample. The McNamara's test, which tests to see if there is a difference between the frequencies highlighted in bold, was significant for this behaviour, which means that a larger number of dogs showed this behaviour at 14 days for the first time compared to dogs that showed the behaviour at 2 days but then didn't show the behaviour again at 14 days. This is important because the data is showing that while the behaviour is being shown at both 2 days and 14 days for some dogs, and it's also reported just at 2 days for some dogs and just at 14 days for some other dogs, there are more dogs that are showing this behaviour just at 14 days compared to just at 2 days. This means that there could be a delayed onset for this behaviour, and that while it may not happen a couple of days into adoption, it could happen later on, say at 2 weeks into adoption. A similar trend was apparent for the separation-related behaviour, scratching or damage to the doorway or non-toy or non-food items when left alone or separated from the adopter in the house. 91% of the dogs were not reported to show this behaviour at either time point, and 9% of the dogs were reported to show this behaviour within the first 14 days of adoption. And again we can see that there is a greater number of dogs that showed this behaviour at 14 days where it had not been reported at 2 days, compared to the number of dogs that just showed this behaviour at 2 days. But the first of the non-prompted behaviours, which was difficulty walking the dog on the lead, It was reported in 3% of dogs by 14 days after adoption, but not for the remaining 97% of dogs. There was no evidence of a difference in the number of dogs that were only reported to have this behaviour at 2 days and not at 14 days, and vice versa. For the next behaviour, which was barking excessively or barking at dogs, people, or inanimate objects, this was only reported in 2% of dogs by 14 days after adoption. And again, the McNamar's test is showing that there's no difference between the frequencies reported here in bold. The final behaviour, which was toileting inside the home, was again reported by 2% of dogs in the first 14 days after adoption. And again, there's no evidence of a difference in the number of dogs that were only reported to have shown this behaviour at 2 days and not at 14 days, and similarly only at 14 days and not previously at 2 days. So what does this all mean? Well, the proportion of dogs that showed the individual behaviours that I looked at is low compared to existing literature on post-adoption behaviour, especially for the unprompted behaviours, difficulty walking on the lead, excessive barking, and toileting indoors. Biting, snapping, or nipping towards the adopter or household member is consistent with existing literature and was the most commonly reported behaviour in this study at 11% by 14 days. Scratching or damage to the doorway, non-toy or non-food items when left alone was lower than has been reported previously. But this is only one sign of separation-related behaviour, and many papers previously have just reported separation anxiety or problems when left alone in general, without detailing the specific behaviours. There were a number of dogs that were reported to show the behaviours at both 2 days and 14 days after adoption, although this proportion is very low. For example, only 2% of dogs showed biting, nipping, or snapping towards the owner or adult household member at both 2 days and 14 days. Significantly more dogs were reported to show this behaviour, and scratching or damage to the doorway or non-toy or non-food items for the first time at 14 days, compared to those dogs that just showed the behaviour at 2 days, which could be evidence of a delayed onset for these behaviours in particular. No significant change in new reports of the other behaviours analysed, difficulty walking on the lead, excessive barking, and toileting in the home between 2 days and 2 weeks post-adoption for individual dogs. And the overall proportion of dogs showing these behaviours was less than the other prompted questions. This means that there may be more intense cases of the behaviour or are presenting more of a problem for the adopter. There is also likely to be a higher occurrence of these behaviours that is not picked up by this question format. It's therefore important that behavioural support is extended past the first couple of days for adopters, and that this support is proactive in nature. It is clear that the prompted questions resulted in a higher frequency of reports, so having this proactive style is very important, especially for behaviours that may not be a problem for the adopter at the time, but could develop into a more serious behavioural problem if left without intervention.
Sorry, sound for this slide seems to have dropped out. Can't do much about it, I'm afraid, at this point, but I'll turn off my mic and hopefully we'll come back to that.
Going forwards, we want to extend this analysis to the final call we have set up at 4 months post-adoption to see how dog behaviour changes through this initial settling in period to routine life in the dog's new home. we also want to explore factors that may increase the risk of certain behaviours being reported, and also evaluate the impact of the behavioural support provided on the occurrence of reported problem behaviour, including whether the behaviour for an individual dog is reported consistently between tie points or eliminated. In fact, it could be that the statistical finding in this study is a direct result of the support received. So when a behaviour is reported at 2 days, appropriate support is provided between that first call and the second call at 14 days, by which point the behaviour has been eliminated. Finally, we also want to see how effective the provision of behavioural support is at reducing the return to kennel rate, or even just a reduction in the number of dogs returned for a behavioural reason. Thank you very much for listening. I'd like to quickly thank Dogs Trust for funding this project, the contact centre agents who make all of the calls and run through the surveys with the adopters over the phone, and also our amazing behavioural support team who provide expert advice for our adopters. I'll now be happy to take any questions, or if you would like to, you can send me a question via the email address on the slide. Thank you very much.
Your camera and microphone, I can ask you some questions. Okay, there we go. Hello, hi. Can't hear you at the moment, Emma. I'll turn your microphone on for you. Okay, try speaking now.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, fantastic. Great.
Great.
So we've had a whole range of questions, so I'm just trying to find, oh, yes, okay. So first one from Amethyst Elson. Has your research accounted for self-selection bias? Owners who agree to post-adoption calls and surveys could be more likely to provide higher standards of care and improved welfare due to a proactive nature impacting behavioural response.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, so first thing to note is that the 2-day post-adoption calls is the standard terms and conditions of adopting a dog. So anybody that adopts a dog from Dogs Trust has to effectively enter into that call process. They obviously aren't forced to answer the questions at all, so there will be some bias in terms of owners who take part in the calls and also who report behaviours to us will be those that perhaps more inclined to worry about their dog's behavioural welfare. And so, yeah, I think that's something that, due to the nature of the project setup, we can't contact people that don't want to be contacted, so we can't pick out that bias. But something that we are doing at Dogs Trust as well is for post-adoption is to launch an online survey with a bit more in-depth and kind of people can answer questions online. So we might see differences in the populations who take part in the calls and take part in the surveys, but will naturally have this bias towards people who want to take part.
Ryan Heppenstall asks, was there any information about owner experience and or dog training between the 2nd and 14-day periods? I'm wondering if training from experienced owners earlier on would stop the behaviours quickly and therefore not be seen at 14 days.
Yeah, again, it's a very good point. With the way that we do our calls, if people do report a behaviour at 2 days, we offer them some advice via a callback from a behaviour specialist at Dogs Trust. So there is the, I think as Josh was talking about at the end, there is the opportunity for people to have advice in between the call points. And we do, if they choose to have the advice from Dogs Trust, we do record that information in a kind of separate support system. We didn't analyse that in this kind of preliminary work that we're presenting, but it's something that we can look for in the future, whether they received advice from Dogs Trust and then whether they reported it a second time. Of course, if they chose to get advice elsewhere, and I think you mentioned experienced owners, they might work on their dogs themselves. So there's kind of, yeah, patterns of behaviour that we're not able to pick up in this kind of project.
Okay, there's a number of people who are asking about actually the owners potentially underreporting behavioural problems, either because they're not necessarily recognising they're a behavioural problem, I'm sort of trying to summarise them, or that they're embarrassed that the dog's showing those behaviours, perhaps if they're particularly a new owner.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So one of the things that we tried to do with this new project was, I think as Josh mentioned, the format of the calls that we have 2 prompted behaviour questions where we ask, have you seen any of these behaviours? And those are the behaviours that we consider as behaviour professionals to be of potential concern. So things like the biting, grabbing and mouthing. So in that respect, and we do that for the sort of those behaviours, and then for behaviours left alone, because we know that separation is a problem again that becomes under-recognised and under-reported. So in asking that in a prompted way, we expected to have higher frequencies of reports, because we might be capturing people that don't perceive it as a problem, but yes, they have seen the behaviour. So we're not asking whether they consider it a concern at the time of the questions. But I think it's interesting still that there will be people underreporting behaviours, and you know, because this is Dogs Trust and this is a support service, we will have that kind of factor of owners being a bit worried to tell us that their dog's bit somebody, because they have the fear that we would take them back, and that's not the case at all. In our contact centre and our behaviour assistants are really good at kind of reassuring owners that, you know, that's not the case. We don't take dogs back for these reasons, we're just trying to help with the behaviour. But the reporting of behaviour obviously is going to have these kind of biases underlying it.
Sarah Ziegler asks, do you have information on behavioural problems on the optional 4-month call?
Yes, so Josh's analysis only looked at the first 2 calls simply because we didn't have enough data for the 4 months. So what we're doing is the same questions are asked at each time point, so we can extend this analysis. And also there was only 3 months worth of data here, so some of the behaviour frequencies are quite low. So we want to expand the data set and expand it to 4 months and see what happens there as well, which will be really interesting.
Great. And there's sort of a couple of other people have asked too. They're just quickly, I think, wanting to know about the behavioural support that the Dogs Trust gives too.
Yeah, so whenever somebody reports an issue, we offer them an advice by way of a callback from either the rehoming centre behaviour people in the centres, but we also have a head office team of behaviour specialists that primarily work on post-adoption, taking calls, so calling these owners back and giving them behaviour advice over the phone. So that kind of covers aspects of training and behaviours, where the behaviour is more complicated, so for particular instances of aggression or where dogs have got a lot of different behavioural problems happening, we do have a referral process for a veterinary referral to our clinical animal behaviour team. So we have a team of regional clinical behaviourists as well. And all of this advice is free. And if they don't opt into these calls or complete these calls, they can always call us and get the same support as well. So what we're doing alongside that support is collecting the data and having a look at what's going on in our data, which is something that prior to this project going live, we didn't have access to. The data just wasn't recorded. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Emma, for stepping in for Joshua, and Joshua for doing the work and the rest of it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I think Joshua is listening and has been listening to the conference. So, yeah, thanks for having us, and obviously working around the furlough situation.
Great. Okay, thank you. So if you want to turn your camera and your mic off, we will now move on to Dayane talk. She's joining us for her. It's very early in the morning from the University de Higgins in Chile. And she's going to be talking about infrared skin temperature on slaughter pigs with tail lesions. So I will just play the video, line it up.
Hi everyone, my name is Dayane Teixeira. I am from Brazil and at the moment I am an assistant professor at the Universidad of Higgins in Chile. In this presentation, I will show the findings of a study about the skin temperature of slaughter pigs with tail lesions, which I carried out in collaboration with Laura Boyle from TEAGASC and Daniel Enriquez Hidalgo from the University of Bristol. This study is based on the tail biting problematic, which is a widespread damage behavior performed by pigs and that causes major welfare problems in intensive pig production systems. Being a victim of tail biting is stressful and painful, and usually tail-bitten pigs are reluctant to spend time feeding to avoid exposing the tails. Thus, they reduce feed intake and average daily gain, resulting in lower carcass weight. Extensive investigation into the epidemiology and consequences of tail biting show that it is also reflects deficiencies in the health status of the pig. Tail lesions are associated with inflammation and change in stress physiology and provide a route for infections and that can be disseminated to different organs. Also, tail lesions are associated with certain pathological lesions such as respiratory diseases and carcass abscessations, but also with visceral and carcass contaminations. The normal body temperature in resting pigs is between 37 and 39 degrees Celsius, but it increases under stress and infection situations. In the case of tail lesions, previous studies have already reported that victims of tail biting are more severely challenged by bacterial infections and that the systemic inflammatory response seemed to be more severe in animals with deep tail inflammations. So, due to the systemic inflammation and or infections, our hypothesis was that increasing severity of tail lesions would be associated with increased body temperature of the pig. Previous studies have attempted to measure the skin temperature of pigs as an indicative measure of their body temperature, especially using the ear base as a reference, as it has high correlation with pigs' rectal temperature. Infrared thermographic cameras provide accurate temperature measurements with good thermal resolution, being very convenient in veterinary medicine. It has advantage over other methods as it is not invasive and avoids spreading infections among sick animals. Infrared thermography images are suitable for measuring skin temperature in pigs, as the density of the hairs offers several bare skinned surface areas, especially at the ear base. So, the aim of this study was to assess the effect of tail lesion severity on skin temperature of slaughter pigs measured at the base of the tail and the ear by infrared thermography camera, and to evaluate the association between the temperature measurements. The study was conducted in 4 experimental days during April and May of 2019 with similar weather conditions in a Chilean slaughterhouse. Data was collected in the layered pen containing approximately 200 pigs per pen, where the pigs were layered at the slaughterhouse before slaughtering. Data was collected from 269 study pigs randomly selected in the layered pen. All pigs had the tail docked, and all male pigs were castrated. The study was carried out by 2 trained people. One person scored the tail lesions and subsequently took a digital thermographic image. Also, a digital image was real-time automatically recorded to each thermal image. This person took two images from all pigs. One picture was from the loin area adjacent to the base of the tail, as we can see in the picture 1. And the other picture was took from the ear base area, as it is the area with the highest correlation with pigs' rectal temperature, as I already mentioned, and we can see in picture 2. The tail lesion score, the sex of the pig, and the number or the code of the image were registered by a second person, who also marked the pigs on the lumbar area using animal marking sticks to track animals already measured for the study, as we can see in the picture. Tail lesions were scored according to severity, where the score 0 represented pigs with no evidence of tail biting and tail was clean and unblemished. And the severity of lesions increases up to the point that the score 4 represents pigs with open wound on the tail, redness, swelling, or with evident necrotic tissue. As pigs were dirty and layered in pens without sprinkling devices, it was difficult to accurately distinguish between tail lesion score 0 and 1. Therefore, they were considered together. So, data were collected from 101 pigs with tail lesion scored as 0 and 1, 51 pigs with tail scored as 2, 51 pigs with tail scored 3, and 66 pigs with tail scored 4. The thermographic camera was calibrated with iron colors ranging from 24 to 37 degrees Celsius, such that those areas on the skin surface of pigs with a temperature higher than the limited temperature appeared as yellow on the images. All animals were imaged from ground level, and the distance between the equipment and the pigs was targeted at 1 meter. All images were downloaded and analyzed using the camera software. For each image, a circle area of approximately 10 centimeters of diameter was selected to highlight the hot spot, which is the highest temperature in the selected area, as we can see on the pictures above. The hotspot of the selected area for each image was automatically displayed, yielding 2 values for each study pig. We used linear mixed model to analyze the effect of tail lesion score and sex of the pig on the hotspot temperature of the selected areas, both at the base of the tail and the ear. Tail lesion score and sex of the pigs were included in the 2 models as fixed effects. For all models, animals was considered as experimental unit. Also, Pearson correlation coefficient was used to analyze the relationship between the hotspot temperature of the image area of the base of the tail and the ear of the pigs. As a result, we found that there was an effect of the severity of tail lesion score on the skin temperature measured at the base of the tail and the ear. Skin temperature measured at the base of the tail was significantly lower for tail scored 0 and 1 than for all other tail lesion scores. Pigs with tail lesion scored 2 had significantly lower skin temperature at the base of the tail than pigs with tail lesions scored 3 and 4, while there was no difference in the skin temperature at the base of the tail between pigs with tail lesions scored 3 and 4. Skin temperature measured at the ear base was significantly lower for pigs with tail scored 0 and 1 than for all other tail lesion scores, with no difference between the other scores. Sex did not affect the skin temperature of pigs recorded at the base of the tail and the ear. So, there was a positive association between both measurements, such that increasing tail lesion severity was associated with increases in skin temperature measured at the base of the tail and the ear. Our finding confirmed the hypothesis that increasing the severity of tail damage is associated with an increase in skin temperature at both regions. Also, despite our study did not include physiological parameters, high value of tail base temperature suggests signs of inflammation and potential infection. The association between tail and ear base temperature are in agreement with previous study, reporting that the systemic inflammatory response seemed to be more severe in animals with deep tail inflammation. As a conclusion, this study showed that the severity of tail lesions increases the skin temperature of pigs measured at the base of the tail and the ear. The findings suggest that even pigs with moderate tail lesions, that is, score 2, may have general inflammation and infections, evidenced by the elevated systemic temperature compared to pigs with none or mild tail lesions, which provides further support for the importance of more detailed measurements of tail lesions severity in pigs. Finally, I want to share with you that the findings from this study was recently published in the journal Frontiers in Veterinary Science, where you can find all other information related to this study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dayane. If you want to turn on your camera and your microphone, you can now answer questions. Hello, hi, can see you.
Hi, yes.
Hi. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. So our first question from Lucy Asher asks, are there any plans to fully automate this?
No, this actually was part of a bigger study about suspect pigs in the slaughterhouse that's detected at the antemortem inspection at the slaughterhouse. And no, that was not the plan of this.
Okay. Question from Young Chu. Thanks for the interesting talk. I'm curious about a similar question raised in an earlier talk. How did you take into account the effect of ambient temperature and control for other disturbances in the lairage when taking the thermal images? Another question is that if you think heel-tail lesions may also affect skin temperature. Thank you.
The first question, yes, about the ambient temperature.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we didn't register because the camera was automatically adjusted that the ambient and the humidity of the ambient. But what we did was to include pigs with all 5 scores on the were imaged in the 4 days. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yep. And the other part was, do you think healed tail lesions may also affect skin temperature?
Healed tail lesion, good question, very good question. I don't think so. I don't think that healed. That's a good question and maybe some idea for next study.
Okay. a question was, were these pigs tail docked to begin with? And if so, how short?
Say again, sorry?
The question is, were these pigs tail docked in the first place? And if so, how short? Before you actually saw.
Short? The pictures that I included in the tail lesion score slides, that's our own pictures. So the maybe between 5 to 10 centimeters.
Okay. So would you consider extending this study to investigate markers of stress versus inflammation to understand further what is causing the raised temperature?
Yes, as I said, this study was part of a bigger study evaluating the prevalence, risk factors, and welfare of suspect pigs that are detected at the ante-mortem inspection. So we don't have plan to focus or to keep studying thermographic. I don't know.
Yep, okay, so here's one you might not be able to answer. It's a bit of a veterinary question. Very nice talk. Does the Chilean pigs receive ractopamine? I hope I'm saying that right. R-A-C-T-O-P-A-M-I-N. Do you think that it could influence the skin temperature? I don't know if you're able to answer that.
I'm not able to answer. No, I don't know.
Okay. Another one was, does the sex of the pig affect the temperature variation during the study? Did you look at that?
Yeah, I looked at it and we didn't find any effect of the sex of the pig on the results.
Okay. Just seeing if there are any other ones. No, I think at the moment that's all of them, unless a few more come in. It's always a bit laggy. Okay, so I'll give it another 10 seconds or so, see if there are any other ones. If you have, type it now. If not, forever hold your silence. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Dayane, for the talk. Much appreciated. I very much liked the bird song we heard in the background too. They sounded very nice. So, thank you. So we'll now.
Thank you, Tom.
We'll now move on to the next presentation. Which is the final presentation of this UFAW virtual conference. And the person who's been hanging on all this while waiting to go is Dr. Dan O'Neill from the Royal Veterinary College in the UK. And his talk is entitled, What's Up, Doc? Exposing Pet Rabbit Welfare Issues Using Vet Compass Veterinary Clinical Records. So I will now play the video.
Welcome, everybody, to this exploration of pet rabbit welfare issues, where we will use Vet Compass clinical records to try and explore one aspect, to try and understand the welfare of this type of animal. Thank you to UFAW for giving me this platform to raise the critically important issue of the welfare of companion animal rabbits. I hope this will begin a whole series of further conversations about how we keep this species as a companion animal, and indeed whether we should keep this species as a companion animal. My name is Dan O'Neill. I was a primary care practitioner for 2 decades before returning to the Royal Veterinary College, where I'm now one of the leaders of the Vet Compass program of research. During this presentation, we will explore some aspects of the wider question about companion animal rabbits, and we will ask whether they represent a welfare crisis that's hidden in open sight, but yet we just can't see it. Every welfare question needs some data to answer it. For this, we will explore the Vet Compass Big Data resource. We will look at the results of a specific rabbit study carried out within VetCompass, and then we will consider all this information to draw some conclusions and plan some next steps. So let's start with an exploration of the wider question about companion animals and whether they are a welfare crisis hidden in open sight. Language is really important. I titled this talk with pet rabbits, but the reality is we should be moving away from the language of pet ownership and moving towards the language of animal guardianship. This follows lots of the thoughts of Elliot Katz, where we need to work away from considering our desires to own animals that are seen as cute and fluffy and move more towards meeting the needs of these animals. We should try and safeguard their welfare rather than simply fitting them into our lives. Their welfare is really the priority. And indeed, one could go so far as asking the question whether a rabbit really is suitable as a companion animal species in the first place. Domestication. In one sense, rabbits have been domesticated for maybe 2 centuries. The Romans first used them 2,000 years ago for food and fur. Even in the UK during World War I and World War II, they were used as a food source. But it's really only in the last 150, 200 years that they've been domesticated and kept as pets, and we have started to bring breeds, individual breeds within the species. So we take an animal from the wild, and what's the worst that can happen when we domesticate? Surely their lives get better? Well, not always. Perhaps we take a wild animal and then it spends a life in this wonderful, well cared for environment. The story so far about rabbits. Rabbits are really common in the UK. They're the 3rd most popular UK pet, maybe 1 million rabbits kept here. Traditionally, they're seen as children's pets. And maybe this is where lots of the welfare issues stem from. The rabbit species is a prey animal. These are alert and timid creatures, and they're driven by survival needs, fight or flight. As a result, they do not really make good pets for small children. Rabbits are fragile, they're easily injured, they're easily frightened, they can bite, and they're ground dwellers, whereas children like to pick rabbits up and hold them at standing height. Attitudes are changing though, and over the last number of decades, rabbit ownership has moved towards being owned by adults, and the rabbits being kept as house rabbits rather than often as solo animals in hutches and gardens. As humans, we do need to consider our social license to operate. If we're keeping rabbits as a companion animal species, we need to consider the needs of the rabbits to ensure that our social license is legitimate. When I was considering the wider question about the welfare of companion animals, I could see that this really was a huge topic with many different aspects, and not all of these aspects could be explored in any single study. So this is a topic that needs to be dissected and then the individual components considered. The components that are important are, in the first place, whether rabbits are suitable as a companion animal species at all, and if so, is that suitability more for adults or children? These animals need to be bred, whereas the welfare issues about breeding them as companion animals. And after that, the welfare issues about purchasing them as companion animals. Once they're owned, we have to consider their behavioral needs. These are a prey species with very complex social and survival behaviors. Are we meeting these needs? We need to consider management, the diet, the housing, solo or companions. Huge issues. And then we need to consider the health of the species. What health issues do they have? So this is a hugely complex question, and it's really the health issues that we're going to focus on in this presentation. So looking at the health, I'm going to try and answer 3 components of this. Demography, so breakdowns of breeds and sex ratios. What are the most common disorders, and what do they die of? And how long do rabbits live? So most of those answers to these health questions will come as numbers, and numbers needs data, and this is where the VetCompass big data resource is going to come into play. So let's explore what VetCompass is. Essentially, this is a very simple concept. Veterinary practices record clinical data on computer systems. VetCompass extracts certain fields, anonymized fields from these computer systems, and loads them to a single database where researchers work on these data to generate answers to specific research questions, publish these as papers, feed them back to the veterinary practices such that the veterinary professional teams can enhance their clinical activities, enhance animal welfare, get better clinical outcomes. And this is a very positive and necessary circle. However, VetCompass also does something else that's very unique among such research projects, and that is that VetCompass feeds information widely to a range of other stakeholders, including regulatory bodies, the charities, but especially to the general public. After all, it's the general public who own these species, who select which ones to buy, who look after them, who choose to take them to vets, and who finally make decisions about euthanasia. VetCompass in the UK, currently almost every single major veterinary group is sharing data with VetCompass, as well as many independent veterinary practices. These practices are spread right across the UK, and currently we have over 30% of all UK practices feeding in data every day into VetCompass. Cumulatively, that gives us information on over 15 million UK patients. When we break these down by species, dogs and cats are by far and away the most common, but there are over 750,000 rabbits in the VetCompass database, and it's this species we're going to focus on for the remainder of this presentation. So let's look specifically at the rabbit study and what we can learn from this and how we can use this to enhance our understanding about the welfare issues around companion animal rabbits. This was a paper that was published in 2019 in the Veterinary Record. This was actually one of our earlier studies. If we were doing this again now, and when we repeat similar studies on rabbits, they will be much larger, much more powerful. But even this study is transformative when it comes to the information we have on rabbits, which previously to this was often based on very small studies of tens or hundreds of rabbits. So those days have gone. We're now moving into the big data era. The methods from an epidemiological perspective, these are the most important. We need to see under the hood. For this study, we had 6,349 rabbits from 107 first opinion clinics that were under veterinary care in 2013. We used information on all 6,000 rabbits to report the demography. For the most common disorders, we looked at a subset, a random sample of 2,506 of these rabbits, where we read the entire of the clinical records to pull out information on all disorders recorded. And for the mortality and longevity, we looked at 370 of these rabbits that died during the study period. Demography. Breakdown by sex. Males are more common than females. Well, even that is a surprising result. Why? Maybe males live longer. Maybe the public just prefer having males. Neutering levels were very high in these rabbits, over 70% in both males and females, with no difference between males and females. But we need to remember these were rabbits that were under veterinary care. And indeed, many of them may have just come for veterinary care just for neutering and vaccination. The median age of the rabbits under veterinary care was 3.2 years, with the males slightly older than the females, 3.3 years versus 3.1 years. So this is some hinting at why there were more males than females. And the median adult body weight was 2.1 kilos, with no difference between males and females. So demography is really important because we need to understand what these species looks like. When it comes to common breeds, the most common breeds were the domestic rabbit, just classed as domestic, but we had Lop, Netherland Dwarf, Lionhead, Miniature Lop, Dutch, Dwarf Lop, and Rex, all very common rabbits. These are all rabbits that look very different from the wild rabbit, and these are further examples of how mankind can selectively breed specific types of domestic animals. Among the disorder prevalence, we had 57% of the rabbits had at least one disorder during 2013. And across the range of disorders, we had 192 distinct disorders recognized. The median annual disorder count was 1, and this did not differ between males and females. When we look at the most common disorders that we're seeing, a lot of these were related to nails, teeth, perineal soiling, bowel problems, and obesity. 7.6% of these rabbits were seen for overgrown molars and 4.3% for overgrown incisors. 4.5% had perineal soiling. This is where fecal material builds up in clumps around the back end. Almost 4% were deemed to be clinically overweight. So these are a very good indication of key health issues in rabbits. Another way of looking at health issues in rabbits is to group them, and this helps us to identify which body systems are most relevant to their health. When we look at it from this perspective, we can see that skin problems, oral problems, bowel problems, eye problems, and parasitic are among the leading issues. But behavioral issues were identified in 5% of rabbits. That in itself is concerning. So we're now starting to use these data to explore the health issues of rabbits. And then finally, mortality and longevity. How long did these rabbits live? Well, the median longevity or average lifespan was 4.3 years, and the males outlived the females by 1.5 years. So perhaps this answers why there are more males than females in the overall population. And it also begs the question, why? What is it about females that causes them to die earlier? When we look at the causes of death, the most common cause of death is fly strike, myiasis, which is a really unpleasant way to die. Anorexia, very general cause. Recumbency, head tilt was very common. Myxomatosis, 5% of rabbits under veterinary care died from myxomatosis. This is a viral disease that's preventable by vaccination. So again, we can start to see some major issues here, a lot of which are related to husbandry. So, some conclusions and further questions. What can we conclude from these results, and where might we go next? Well, from a demographic point of view, we can conclude that males are more common and they live slightly longer, 1.5 years longer. There's no difference in between the sexes in body weight or neutering, and our most common breeds are domestic, a general catch-all group for rabbits, Lop and Netherland dwarf. And there needs to be some questions asked about the welfare issues of these specific breeds. Have we really selected and developed these breeds with welfare in mind, or are we just selecting them based upon what looks cute? Is it the needs of the rabbit that's the priority, or the needs of the human? On average, the lifespan of rabbits was 4.3 years. Males live longer. Some questions need to be asked here. And fly strike was the top cause of death. Fly strike, a very unpleasant cause of death, and is preventable to a degree. So some questions need to be asked here about the management and the husbandry of these rabbits. And when it comes to most common disorders, nail issues, but also dental, overgrown incisors and molars, perineal soiling, which in itself is an issue, but also leads on to fly strike, and obesity, completely a management-driven issue. So there are some next questions. Obviously, this is exploring just one aspect of rabbit welfare, but a deeper exploration of dental management issues around perineal soiling. We need to explore skull conformation and how does this affect the health and welfare of rabbits. Animal husbandry, how do we keep these rabbits, and is that a welfare issue? And also we need to recognize the power of big data, of VetCompass big data, to answer these questions. At the start, I posed a big question. Are companion animal rabbits a welfare crisis hidden in open sight? What can we conclude? I think we can conclude there is some evidence here that companion animal rabbits are a welfare crisis hidden in open sight. The high levels of death from unpleasant disorders such as fly strike, preventable disorders such as myxomatosis, and the high level of health issues related to dental, related to nails, related to obesity, related to perineal soiling suggest that there are opportunities here to improve animal welfare. In conclusion, I would like to thank the other authors of this study, Hermine Craven, Dave Brodbelt, David Church, and Joe Hedley. The full paper is available from the veterinary record site, and I would like to thank all the veterinary practices who contribute data and collaborate with VetCompass. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Very hard-hitting final presentation there. If you can turn your camera and microphone on, please. Great.
Hello.
Hello, great, I can hear you. Excellent. So there we go. So we're open for questions. First one came in from Carol Gray. She said, fab presentation, thanks. I love the idea of social license to operate for guardians of companion animals. Please, could you share the source of this term?
Oh, really good question. I can get that, Carol, and pass it on to you. This is a term that I've been considering over the past couple of years when it comes to ownership of animals, not just rabbits. We're doing currently studies on reptiles, on hamsters, as well as dogs and cats. And I'm increasingly starting to see that we need to move away from what the owner wants and towards prioritizing what the animal wants and what the animal needs. And even from Dan Weary's talk yesterday about truth effectiveness, even what the animal knows, understands, remembers, and can learn from. So increasingly, I think that actually will enhance the ownership experience of a lot of owners in the first place. A happier animal probably means a happier owner. But I can definitely pass that on to you, Karen.
Okay, so I don't know whether or not it's because it's the end of 2 days of conferences and things. So if you've got questions for Dan, there is a lag for sending them through. We have one here from Sarita. Oh, here we go. From my understanding, all data comes from vet clinics. Hence, most likely these rabbits already showed signs of disorder. Is there a reason why you did not collect and combine additional data from private owners who feel their rabbit is in good health? I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, actually, it's almost the reverse of that a little bit. If you look at the proportion of rabbits in the study that had at least one disorder, it was just 57%. So over a full year period, 43% of those rabbits had no disorders whatsoever. The underlying study included rabbits that were seen at least once in 2013, and or those that were seen before 2013 and afterwards, even if they didn't turn up at all in 2013. So our assumption was that those rabbits were at home, happy, healthy, doing fine, didn't need to see the vet, but they were included in the study denominator population. Also, a lot of rabbits that attend primary care practices attend for preventive medicine prophylactic, so they will come in for vaccinations, for neuterings, and owners would sometimes use veterinary practices just to buy food. So in effect, we are including a very large proportion of the wider population of rabbits that have no current recognized illness. I choose the word recognized very carefully because as well as the social license to operate, I'm also increasingly starting to focus my attention on disorders that are present in animals, but that owners don't recognize. And just because we don't recognize the problem doesn't mean that the animal isn't suffering. Good question, very good question.
So Rebecca King asks, did you look at the median age of when a rabbit is registered at the vets? I wonder if they registered when the owner first gets them, like with puppies or kittens, or only when a health issue occurs. Sorry, you might have...
No, another very good question. That wasn't part of this study. That could well indeed be part of this study. Our experience with dogs and cats, though, is that, right, this is a slightly different concept. So in the real world, animals have a single life. They're born, they live, they die. In the vet compass world, certainly for our dogs have between 2 and 3 lives. In other words, each experience they have with a new owner or with a new veterinary practice becomes a new vet compass life. So a lot of animals are registered in middle age because owners choose to move to a new veterinary practice or the animal is rehomed. So it definitely is not the case that these animals just turn up as babies for the first vaccine and then are never seen again. But again, very good question. And as always, it's once you ask the question and start to explore it, that's when you really start to learn about these data and how to understand them.
Maria Hotzel asks a question which is related. Do you think that some of the causes of death, some quite gruesome, maybe reflect pet guardians' delay, or I would add unawareness to their pet in deciding when to take them to the veterinarian? Perhaps people only realise the rabbit is sick when the symptoms are advanced.
Wonderful question. And that exactly is the point I was making in the second last answer, is that illness and awareness of illness are not the same thing. The awareness of illness is a human issue. That's a human piece of knowledge. Illness is an animal issue. It's an animal piece of knowledge. They know that they're sick. They're not the same thing, but we kind of assume they are, and they definitely are not. And you've absolutely hit the nail on the head here. A lot of these rabbits with terminal fly strike are presented with that condition, but in reality, they probably have had days and days and days, and probably much longer, of lead up to that. So perineal soiling, often incontinence, and often poor husbandry, where the bedding is soiled and then that attracts flies in the first place. Yeah, so really good question, which hits home at the fact that we need to be raising awareness with owners of what to look out for, rather than just waiting for them to realise of their own accord that their animals are ill.
Question from Jenny Cooper. Do you have any idea of the percentage of rabbits in the UK that are under veterinary care, i.e. attending the vet at least once or twice per year, compared to the number of pet rabbits that are not under any veterinary care?
Again, that's a fabulous question. It is really, I'm on camera so I can do this, I can lift my finger, hold in the air. It is really an estimate in the first place as to how many rabbits there are in the UK, let alone what proportion are registered. The poll report that's run each year is an excellent resource, because it tends to run a survey of the wider population. So that gives us some information, but the reality is we don't really know. It is believed that a relatively high proportion of owners will seek veterinary care. Certainly the ones that are bought from some of the larger pet stores like Pets at Home, those rabbits tend to get neutering vouchers, they tend to get vaccination vouchers, and that encourages them to attend the veterinary practice that's associated often with those stores, and that in itself is a wonderful thing for welfare. As to whether those owners keep on coming back, that's not really good question.
And sort of rated once again, do you believe that the mortality rates of rabbits in this study represent something close to true mortality, or do rabbit deaths tend to be less reported than other companion animals?
My perception is that rabbit deaths are much less reported than other animals. My perception, and this is from 2 decades in veterinary practice, is that a lot of rabbits are just found dead. And when, over the years, as I spoke to owners, the rabbits just suddenly died. It was magic. There was no prior awareness or knowledge the rabbits were sick. Obviously, that's the human issue, the human awareness. The rabbit would have known there were issues. Secondly, we include within Vet Compass information on any animals that are cremated, or the veterinary practice deals with the disposal of the body. So we are trying to capture some of this information, but it is likely that many owners may choose to bury their rabbits at home if they die at home, and therefore those data are lost to the big data resource that's Vet Compass. That's less likely with dogs and cats, so we're much more likely to capture their deaths. So yes, I would agree with you. I think there are a lot of rabbits that die in the domestic setting, are buried in the domestic setting, and never enter the Vet Compass database.
So I'm going to put 2 questions together. So first one is, thank you for the talk. Do you as a vet recommend that people should own rabbits? And related to that too is, what role do you think vets should play in encouraging suitable pet choice by clients, and how?
Oh, wow, super questions. Okay, so I'll answer the first one from a personal point of view. So this is just my personal view, right? So I was in practice for 22 years. As I get towards the end of that period of time, when owners would ask me about owning a rabbit, I would question them about who the rabbit was for, what the provisions would be made for the rabbit, where it would live, would it be on its own. My standard advice for the majority of those owners, especially the ones who told me that the rabbit was for a child, or it would be kept on its own, or it would be kept in a hutch, was to get a Tamagotchi. This obviously is now out of date, and people today probably won't know what that was, but it was a little electronic toy that a child could play with. I just got to the point when I felt that rabbit ownership, certainly if it was going to live in a hutch on its own in a garden owned by a child, was completely inappropriate. However, that was just my personal opinion at that time. It was that sort of welfare drive that was one of the pushers for me to leave general practice and to set up Vet Compass. The second question you have from a veterinary perspective, I think the veterinary profession has an enormous role to play in improving the welfare of domestic rabbits. There are still lots and lots of rabbits owned. Those rabbits, even the ones owned by children, can have a reasonable quality of life, but there needs to be veterinary advice given to owners to overcome the decades and decades and decades of culture that says rabbits are children's pets, that are fluffy, that are kept in gardens, that are fed rabbits, that are fed carrots rather. The veterinary profession needs to be very vocal and very loud in explaining that these are community animals, they're social, they need to be kept in groups. They may be kept quite well as house rabbits, and that ideally they should not be children's pets per se.
Thank you. And I think the last question, which is again a 2.1, did you examine any possible differences due to owner demographics such as geographical area or age of the owner? And 2, does being in a bonded pair or not make any difference to a rabbit's likelihood of developing disease?
Fabulous questions that I think I probably could have added to that second last slide as to the future questions. Vet Compass collects data in an anonymized fashion. So we do not collect information on the owners. So we wouldn't know the age of the owners or their family setup. So from that point of view, Vet Compass is not designed to do studies of owners. It's designed to do studies of animals. That said, we do get a partial postcode, so we could break that down across the country, and we are already doing that in studies of dogs and cats. We haven't done that yet, but we could well do that. The second question about the pairs, we do collect IDs of owners. We don't know who the owners are, but we do collect IDs, so we could identify animals that were owned by the same owner, provided they presented during the same year. We didn't in that study, but actually it's a really good question, and it's one that we could and probably will do in the future study.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thank you very much for waiting for 2 days to answer questions and things. It's very much appreciated. So that is the end of the formal session. So thank you to all the speakers we've had over the last 2 days. We very much hope you've enjoyed the session. Hugh, if you want to say a few words, you want to turn your camera and your microphone on. I'm going to turn mine on too, so you can see me as well, because I know I've just been a voice. So thank you for joining. Just to remind you, I've had a question from people as to whether or not any of the other questions that weren't answered are going to get passed to the speakers. We're certainly going to try and do that. There's a few issues to do with that, but if I can, I will. And if they want to answer them, they'll do that, and we'll look to put something up. Just a reminder for certificates of attendance, if you need one and you haven't downloaded one, this is your last opportunity to do so. They're in the handouts, so I would suggest that you do it now. And I'm going to share 2 slides quickly. So the first one, I'll stop pausing my screen. First one is to do with the UFAW Wiley Blackwell Series 2. If you want the code to get money off for that, please download that too. And I'm going to, here we go, a quick push as well, that if you've enjoyed this meeting, now it's not going, yes, good. So if you've enjoyed this meeting, please think about coming along to the, is it showing? Yeah, to the UFAW meeting next year, which is the 29th, oh, there we go, 29th and 30th of June, which we're hoping will be a physical meeting at the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh on animal welfare, emerging challenges and solutions. And that's what I want to say. So thank you for listening, and apologies for any technical things, but I think we've learned a lot, and I think we got smoother as it went on. Hugh, to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. I think you've said most of the things I needed to say, but just to reiterate, thanks especially to all the presenters and poster presenters for coming to the meeting. Thanks to everyone else who came along, especially thanks to those who've been asking questions and tweeting. It really helps with the discussion. It's been a fantastic and eclectic couple of days, as it always is at UFAW meetings, and I'm really delighted to see that it works online as well as it does face-to-face. So that's been a real learning experience for us, and I think we'll be thinking long and hard about doing some virtual events again, as well as hopefully seeing you face-to-face in Edinburgh next year. As Steve said, don't forget that you can watch the talks online and also go and look at the posters. I know I'd like to actually watch some of the talks again and take them in. So a real advantage of these online events is that you can go back and watch it again if you were really fascinated by something. If you did enjoy this meeting, please do consider joining UFAW to keep up with what we're doing in future. Our members really help support our work, as do those who've donated. So thanks again to all those who donated to make this conference possible. We really appreciate your support. If any of you would like to support us, please do pop over to the website and you can have a look at how to donate or join. Congratulations again to the medal winners and the young scientists. So that's Dan Weary, Irene Kamelink and Faye Clark. Hugely deserved awards for them. And at the end, a huge thank you to the UFAW staff who've made this meeting possible, and they've put a huge amount of work in. You've seen Steve undergoing chronic unpredictable stress for 2 days whilst he runs this meeting from his desktop at home. There's also an office staff and an admin staff back at UFAW who've been doing a huge amount of work processing all of your registrations and making sure that all the organisation for this meeting works seamlessly. So if you were all here, I'd ask you to give them a huge round of applause as well, but I'll say a real heartfelt thanks from me for making it work. So thank you very much once again for coming, and have a safe and somewhat shorter than usual trip home. Thank you very much.
Thank you.